Let's walk through some examples of using two-way binding with the ng model directive. We're going to add a new capability to our application. We're going to make a page that will allow users to create new events. I'll start by going into my app and creating a new HTML page. And I'll call this new event HTML. Now, in order to get to that new event HTML, I want to be able to navigate to it through my menu bar up at the top. So I'm going to go to my event details page, and I'm going to go out to my nav bar and I'm going to add an item to it. Alright, that'll give us a link to that page. Now to start off with that page, I'm just going to grab all the HTML from this page and copy it into the new HTML page. And I'll go up here and I'm going to take the contents of this div and delete them. Now I'll create a new div, and I'm going to give that div a controller, and I'm going to name that Edit Event Controller. I'm naming it Edit Event because at some point in the future, I plan on making this page not only create new events, but also edit them. I'll throw on some padding to match the other page, create a container, and a title, and now I'll create a form to contain the input elements that the user is going to put information into. Now I'm going to create a label and input pair for the name, date, time, and location of the event. Now a couple input fields for city and province. And lastly, a label and input for an image. And now to make it convenient for users as they put in their image URLs, I'll create an image tag that will be bound to that image URL. Like before, I'm using the source directive for the image. And now I'll put in a couple of buttons, both to save and cancel. Okay, our HTML is pretty much ready. But one of the things that's going to cause us a problem if we try to render this is that there is no edit event controller that exists. So before we create that file, we need to go down and add it to the list of scripts included in the page. And now we can create that controller. And now that our controller is in place, let's go check out what we've done. I'll refresh the page and we can see we've got that new navigation event up at the top. I'll click on that, and now I've got my new event page. Now this looks really nice, but unfortunately it doesn't really do anything. No matter what I type in here, if I click save or cancel, nothing's happening. Of course we saw that there's no click directives on these buttons, so nothing could happen. But more importantly, if I did handle the click event on these buttons, I would have no data inside my scope. What I want is to have data inside my scope. So let's go back into our HTML and add a model directive to each of these fields. Starting with the name, I'll add the model directive, and I'm going to call the name of this model event.name. And I'll add corresponding items to each of the other fields. Now if you'll refer back to our other controller with the sample data in it, you'll see that I've matched up the names with the structure of the sample data that we created. Okay, that should be the last of them. Now since we have no click events on either of our buttons, not much is going to happen, but one thing did get wired up correctly, and let's see what that is. If I come to the image and put in an image URL, we can see that that image tag is automatically bound to what I put into this image URL. As soon as I change this URL at all, it updates and tries to render the new image, but because that's not a valid image URL, nothing comes back. And that is two-way binding. Going back to our code, we can see that the input box has a model of event.imageURL, and the image has a source of event.imageURL. That's created an event object on my scope and given it an image URL property that is bound to the image's source. And that right there is two-way binding. As I change the contents of that text box, that automatically updates the contents of the model in the scope, which in turn automatically updates anything bound to that. So for example, if I was to come up in here and add in a div and bind that to one of the properties on my event, that would get updated as well. You can see as I type, it updates the binding. This is one of the really beautiful parts of Angular. This sort of automatic two-way binding can really save yourself a lot of coding. Now for completeness, let's add some click handlers to our buttons. Now I want you to take note of something. Right here in this call to save event, I've passed in an object called event. Remember when we created the click handlers for the up and down voting? We passed in a session object. Here we're passing in the event object. Again, Angular is finding the correct object that belongs to this HTML and allowing us to pass it into a function. So now when we create this function, that event object is populated with the data from each of those fields. We can improve this by using alert and printing out one of those fields. And here we see that that data is available back in the scope. Let's go back and implement that cancel buttons handler, and we'll have it navigate back to the event details page. Alright, and there you have it. We've implemented two-way binding by creating form fields, giving them the model directive, and binding those form fields to pieces of data in our model that are held inside of our scope object. Now let's wrap up two-way binding with a quick quiz. True or false, two-way binding will update on every keystroke. This is true. Which HTML elements work with two-way binding? That is the input, select, and text area elements. What will happen if you reference a property that doesn't exist in a model directive? Whenever you reference a property that doesn't already exist, Angular will create that property for you on the scope.